does an ape man walk the uncharted forests of America's Northwest? What unknown monster of the sea grappled with this U.S. Navy frigate in South American waters? Why did people raise up this enormous circle of stones in Orkney 4,000 years ago? Who drew this giant, the largest figure in the world, on Chile's loneliest mountain? What hands fashioned the skull of doom? Does it bring death? Why do stones move by themselves in California's Death Valley?
Strange mysteries of land, sea, and space are explored by the world's best-selling science fiction writer, Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, Friday nights at 9 o'clock on Nebraska ETV.
Next on Wonderworks, And the Children Shall Lead.
Would you like to do work for me when you grow up?
No, thank you, Miss Lily. I want to be a school teacher.
Now, look, son, we don't have any racial problem here in Catesville, and I'm not going to have you coming in here and stirring up trouble.
What's wrong with y'all? Look, my daddy don't want me and Lloyd messing with you anymore. And this is our park, so you'd better get.
Tune in Sunday night at 7.
Okay, the reason that the farm question and the agriculture crisis is so important is because what's wrong with agriculture is what's wrong with this country.
We're going to have a sale here today. As we said, this is an order by the District Court of Grand County.
To the farmers of the Midwest, the protests of the 1980s are nothing new. Time and time again over the past 100 years, especially during times of economic adversity, farmers have joined together to protest low prices, bankruptcy, foreclosure, and eviction. Join host Richard Reeves as we discover the similarities between those movements and the
In Search of Excellence is brought to you by Merrill Lynch, where individuals, institutions, corporations, and governments come for a wide range of financial and investment services worldwide. Merrill Lynch.
The all-new Let's Make a Deal, weekdays at 4 p.m.
Next Wednesday at 8, 7 Central, Premiere Week continues with The Insiders, followed by the season premieres of Dynasty and Hotel.
You'll love it.
'85, America and the world since World War II.
America is back, looking to the 80s with courage, confidence, and hope.
Welcome home, Columbia. Beautiful, beautiful.
We believe that peace is at hand.
ABC News special. The years 1945 to 1985. From New York, Ted Koppel and Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We're glad you could join us this evening because 1945 to 1985 are among the most momentous years in human history. We're actually in a television studio in New York City, but we are surrounded by the objects. Some people would call them the relics, but certainly the symbols of those times, both good and bad. Now, we know it's impossible to deal with everything here tonight that has touched our lives over the last 40 years, so we're going to concentrate on those most important events that have affected the way we live today.
We feel that perhaps the most important event is a continuing one that's been around since 1945, the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each one of us is part of that ongoing confrontation, whether we like it or not, and that will be our main focus tonight. We'll be hearing the stories of men and women who were there when decisions were made that determine in large measure how we live today. We do hope you'll stay with us.
The people of IBM are proud to bring you 4585. We hope that this unique look at the events of the past 40 years will offer you new insight into America's past and America's future.
My first thought whenever they told me the IBM plant was going to a fully automated plant was, oh no, here goes my job.
Stan Porter is one of 6,000 people working for IBM in Lexington, Kentucky. The plant there will soon be one of the most fully automated in the world. But the move to automation hasn't meant a single layoff in Lexington. One of the reasons is IBM's commitment to retraining, teaching people new skills to work with new technology.
Everybody has kind of got a new outlook on it now. It makes everybody now, they feel that it's going to make the jobs better.
We've taken the mundane, highly repetitive task of assembling these miniature electronic components away from the operator and moved the operator one step back into the process, so he's now responsible for a system. So not only have we been able to improve our quality through automation, we've also enhanced that person's job.
What makes me feel good about retraining is that it's twofold to me. The first one is job security. I don't have to worry about having a job as long as I continue to do my job well. And the second thing is it has always brought opportunity. Every time that you're retrained, there's an opportunity and a challenge.
Retraining has helped IBM avoid layoffs for nearly 50 years. What's happened in Lexington and everywhere at IBM proves that a company can move ahead without leaving people behind.
This man is crazy.
Vivacious.
He'll tell you exactly what he feels.
I want that item. Not need, I want that item.
This is Hamner Williams teaching business at Hampton University as part of IBM's faculty loan program. He joined the faculty for a year while IBM continued to pay his salary.
He really makes you look at things the way they're going to be.
There's no snow jobs with Ham. Either you know the answer or you don't.
Hamner Williams is one of over 600 IBM employees who have participated in the faculty loan program since 1971.
So it's not just book knowledge that we're learning, but practical experience from a person who's been in business for some time.
I've taken so much being in the business community, and I wanted a place to turn around and give back to someone else. I love teaching, and I love asking the tough questions, and then watching the light going in their eyes. Let me tell you, that's what being here is all about.
It was the end of the war, back in 1945, and this Jeep is of that vintage. Back in 45, when you spoke of the war, there was no need to explain which one you were talking about. America was not only the most powerful nation in the world, it was, arguably, the most powerful nation in the history of the world. After all, we had the bomb, and nobody else did. That would change, of course, and a lot sooner than we expected, when we discovered that the Russians had their own bomb, and when we learned how they got it, the Rosenbergs. That was an espionage scandal that makes all today's stuff about the British and the Russians sending each other's spies home seem pretty tame by comparison. But then we've had 40 years of competition between the West and the Soviet Union. A lot of things have changed in 40 years, but that hasn't. Our music has changed. I don't know about you, but I don't think I know the words to a single popular song today, but I probably know most of the lyrics to just about every song on this jukebox. Bogey and Bacall. They were very big back then. And if you're asking Bogey who, it's probably past your bedtime. Lucky Strike, which had gone to war in camouflage green, was back in its now familiar colors. No filters, of course. That was before filters and before we knew that cigarettes cause cancer and heart disease and emphysema. This was the time when the Soviet Union was not yet our enemy and Germany and Japan were not yet our friends. By the end of this decade, Americans would be fighting in another war. But in 1945, war was the last thing we wanted to hear about. It may be difficult for more recent generations to understand the jubilation that swept America with the news that the World War II was finally over. This picture in Life magazine captured that mood. VJ Day, an anonymous sailor kissing an equally anonymous nurse. And this is where it happened, Times Square. People poured into the streets by the thousands to celebrate the end of the war. 40 years ago this month, the war was over.
Flashed on there, the Japs have surrendered, have signed the surrender papers.
Life magazine photographer Alfred Eisenstadt was in Times Square that day.
And I saw that sailor, and he grabbed every woman inside.
I met the girl coming across the street right here, grabbed her, put my foot before her, right down.
So what was later described as the last good war was behind us, and we came home by the shipload. More than 9 million Americans who wanted simply to get out of their uniforms and get on with their lives.
And the boys are home again, all over the world.
America demobilized to the bebop of Dizzy Gillespie. And got back to the business of courting and making up for lost time to the strains of Frank Sinatra.
The girl that I marry will have to be.
College education was free for most of these new veterans, courtesy of the GI Bill. There was a housing problem, but that problem was transformed into an opportunity by a builder named Levitt.
We believe that every family in the United States is entitled to decent shelter.
For a vet, a new Levitt house was less than $7,000, no money down. America was sick of war and the tools of war. It walked away from them. Navy ships were mothballed. Surplus aircraft destroyed. America was eager to get on with peace. The theory was that we wouldn't need all those conventional weapons anyway. After all, we had the bomb. Stuart Symington was in the War Department at the time.
The first job that I had as Assistant Secretary of War was to go around and close up the bases all over the world, which was a terrible mistake based on later developments.
Dean Rusk was also in the War Department.
Now, in retrospect, it's clear to me that we subjected Joseph Stalin to intolerable temptations through our own weakness. And it has taken us many years to pick up the pieces from that great mistake involved in our demobilization after VJ Day.
But in 1946, you have to remember, Americans still saw the Russians as a wartime ally. It was difficult to see anything the Russians might be doing in Europe as representing a threat to the United States. Our war, after all, was over, finished. It took Winston Churchill to raise the first alarm, and even then, not everyone was paying attention. It happened here, in the gymnasium at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Westminster was awarding Churchill an honorary degree. It was such a big occasion that President Truman accompanied Churchill on the train trip from Washington. Clark Clifford was one of Truman's young legal aides.
We played poker every evening and got to know Mr. Churchill well. He turned out to be really quite a poor poker player. So the idea after a while was carry it along and make it a pleasant occasion. I think maybe Mr. Churchill may have discussed the speech that he made with the president before we reached Fulton, Missouri, but the rest of us did not know it. It was completely new to me.
Fulton was all decked out to welcome its famous guests. There was no indication that one of the most memorable speeches of the post-war period was about to be delivered. But Churchill was such a popular hero in this country that people traveled for miles for a glimpse of him, including several people who took color home movies. Winston Churchill did not disappoint them. With one speech, Churchill began the gradual shift of America's attention toward events in Eastern Europe. With one phrase, he summed up Soviet expansionism.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Churchill attacked the Soviets for endangering the peace of the world and called for an Anglo-American military alliance to halt further communist expansion. Stalin's reaction was predictable. He was furious, called the speech a declaration of war. But it would be a mistake to suggest that the Iron Curtain speech was an instant success in the United States.
And I thought Churchill was too belligerent when I read the speech in the Los Angeles Times. I wondered if he wasn't seeing dangers there that, or exaggerating a situation and seeing dangers that really weren't there. However, he proved to be right.
This was the image of communist expansionism at the time, a growing red tide directed from Moscow. That image was to remain with America for decades. Reluctantly, the United States was coming to realize that somewhere we would be drawing the line.
This is where the line was drawn. Here, where the Bosporus Strait bisects Turkey into its European and Asian halves. It seemed that Soviet interests were growing at an alarming rate in the Eastern Mediterranean. They had already seized Eastern Europe, and there wasn't much America could do about that. But here, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Soviet power could and would be checked.
Harry Truman would recall, after leaving office, what prompted him to draw the line, what would come to be known as the Truman Doctrine.
Let me put it this way. If you post your property with no hunting signs, you're a lot less likely to wake up some morning and find a place full of hunters who had no right to be in there.
In Greece, government supporters and Greek communist guerrillas were engaged in a ferocious civil war. There were no American or Russian troops in Greece. But on this occasion, America's no hunting signs took the form of military aid, and that made a difference to the ill-equipped Greek regular army. Jack Matathias was then a Greek soldier.
In a matter of a couple of days, everything changed in my unit. We got GMC jeeps and big trucks filled with supplies.
U.S. arms and food helped turn the war on the ground and convince Stalin to abandon the Greek communists. Milovan Djilas, now a Yugoslav dissident, was a top official in the Yugoslavian government at the time.
When we were in Moscow in February 1948, Stalin then was definitely resolved to not to help against any help in Greece. As he said, I will quote you in Russian, "Svernut."
Stalin was saying, fold up the Greek guerrillas, fold them up. But America was unaware that the Soviet Union had left the Greek communist guerrillas to fight their own fight. Instead, it seemed that on the first try, the policy of containment had worked. But was the lesson that if the U.S. gets tough with the Russians, they back down? Or was it, aid works if you give it to countries which are strong enough to fight their own fights? There would never be a clear answer. Post-war Europe was a basket case. People were hungry, homeless, and without hope. The chairman of the European Recovery Conference was Sir Oliver Franks.
there wasn't steel coming out of the steel plants because the coal wasn't coming out of the ground. And then there'd been a disastrous winter. The grain wasn't growing in the fields. So the problems were really two: how people could get enough food to live and how they could get the wherewithal for productive industry to go to work.
Simple charity dictated doing something for the Europeans, even for our wartime enemies, the Germans. But U.S. policymakers also had one wary eye on the Russians. Eastern Europe had already fallen to the communists. Western Europe was clearly a right target. U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced the rescue plan that would bear his name at the Harvard University commencement address of 1947. America would provide money, equipment, materials, but only as part of a unified plan for rebuilding all of Europe. The Soviet Union was invited to participate at a planning conference in Paris. Humanitarian? Yes, but it was much more sophisticated than that. Valentin Berezhkov was Stalin's interpreter at the time.
Actually, it was not an idea to help us, but to put it into a situation where we would be unable to accept it, and then certainly we would be blamed for not accepting it.
When Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov walked out of the planning session, it was clear to everyone that the U.S. had succeeded in turning its economic strength into an anti-communist weapon. The goods shipped to Europe in these bags and boxes and the money sent to European banks helped rebuild Western Europe while strengthening its ties to the United States. Meanwhile, half a world away, a shattered Japan was also being built. Only today, Japan's telephone and telegraph company, Nippon, announced that it's offering a seminar to U.S. businessmen on how to market their goods in Japan. It's hard to remember that 40 years ago, Japanese exports, like this vase, were a synonym for cheap and trashy.
Tokyo was then in ruins. Homeless people were seen asleep on bridges, on the sidewalks, or in underground passages.
Two men symbolized the change. General Douglas MacArthur, the image of self-confident American power, and the Japanese Emperor, Hirohito, who had been retained only as a symbol. Even Joe DiMaggio was enlisted in the Americanization of Japan. Children were being taught that democracy was a synonym for everything good. Historian Toshio Nishi was one of those children.
To me, democracy meant, well, at the school, I should behave better instead of being a terror. Don't beat up as much, don't fight as much. And when school discussion comes, within the classroom, school discussion comes, democracy meant, well, you listen to everybody.
Yoshikazu Saeki was a young economist.
I think the U.S. felt if they made Japan economically successful or made Japan politically stable, they would be able to contain the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China.
The superpowers were rearranging the entire world in their own image, or so it seemed. But there were other forces at work. Colonialism was crumbling. Kenneth Kaunda, now president of Zambia, was a school teacher in the British colony of Northern Rhodesia.
USA was born through a revolution. And I felt then that their support for the colonial people's struggles for independence was based on their own experience.
In principle, that was true. America did favor independence. But again and again, U.S. sentiment favoring anti-colonialism collided head-on with the new imperative of anti-communism, as in French Indochina. George Elsey was an aide in the Truman White House when that question came up.
At least initially, you had to give the French a hand, that the way to keep communism from spreading in Southeast Asia was to support the French, at least on a temporary basis.
And the British Empire, too, was falling apart. The empire on which the sun never set withdrew from India and Southeast Asia. British influence declined in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. In the Middle East, Jewish underground groups were fighting the British Army to establish an independent state for themselves. European Jews had suffered a particular horror during the war because of their religion. Now they wanted a homeland in Palestine. State Department experts recommended against a Jewish state, but President Truman resisted their arguments about protecting oil reserves and possible Jewish-Arab warfare.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
The neighboring Arab states objected violently. Israel, with its Muslim shrines, was as holy to them as to the Jews. As a result of this and subsequent Middle Eastern wars, millions of Palestinians would eventually become refugees in the Arab world and make their own demands, politically and with terrorism. It was 1948. There were plenty of crises overseas, but the American public was caught up with the post-war boom, especially the baby boom.
When you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you. When you're laughing, the sun comes shining through. But when you're crying, you bring on the rain, so stop your sighing. Be happy again, keep on smiling, 'cause when you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you.
Berlin, 1948. The hated capital of Hitler's Germany was now the center of a new struggle.
Berlin under cold siege in the Cold War. U.S. armored cars patrolling the American sector. Tension mounting as the Soviet type...
Berlin was cut off from the West. The Soviets blockaded the Autobahn, stopped the trains, cut off the electricity. The West had the choice of standing by and watching West Berlin move into the Soviet column, or running the blockade and the risk of war with the Soviet Union. The policy of containment was being tested.
The question was, should we put American troops on trains and have the train move into Berlin? I was for putting them in. I felt certain that we had the bomb, and Stalin didn't, and that he would never shoot Americans off the train.
The only way left to supply Berlin without confrontation was by plane. Every day, the airlift supplied tons of milk, flour, and coal. Everything needed to keep Berlin alive. Sir Freddie Laker was one of the pilots.
Occasionally, there were the MiGs would buzz the aeroplanes, and that was all rather frightening. And they'd come alongside and waggle in their wings, but no one took any notice. No one was going to follow them, for example, as suggested.
As the confrontation dragged on month after month, it reinforced the lesson that communism was a strong menace in Western Europe. But the Soviets, too, were learning something from the airlift. James Callahan was a parliamentary secretary.
The Soviets learned a lesson from that the Western democracies were not going to be browbeaten in this particular matter. We had our rights in Berlin, and we have sustained them.
To fight off the threat of Soviet expansionism would take a collective security agreement of European nations and the United States. In the face of the communist danger, the Senate ratified the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, shortly after the Soviets lifted the Berlin blockade. The satisfaction of having made the Soviets blink first was short-lived. Within 4 months, a B-29 crew on a routine reconnaissance flight in the North Pacific brought back radioactive air samples.
I'll never forget the morning that General Norstad came in and said to me, I have bad news for you. The Soviets have just exploded an atomic weapon. And I said, Laurie, that can't be true. It's not possible. I couldn't have done it based on what everybody said. And he said, well, they've done it.
Someone had passed America's atomic bomb secrets to Russia. This was an undisputed fact that the whole world knew. The federal government had laid the crime at the doorstep of two native New Yorkers, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
Their conviction for passing atomic secrets to the Russians and their eventual execution fueled American paranoia and fed the public anti-communist frenzy.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist.
You are to appear before the Committee on Un-American Activities.
I intend to name names.
Their allegiance is to Russia.
Are you a member of the Communist Party?
Stand away from the
Or
stand.
have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Stand away from the stand.
Fight for the Bill of Rights, which
I'll
was
stand
destroyed.
away from the stand.
This pig, J. Parnell Thomas, congressman, who was a real monster, who was sitting up there with his gavel.
Mr. Stripling, the next witness.
As they'd started to open their mouths, gavel. Are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? You know, it was unbelievable.
Tense drama grips a hearing of the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Mr. Hiss is lying.
Alger Hiss was accused of spying for the communists.
He was a top member of the State Department bureaucracy, that somebody in those positions could have been or had communist sympathies.
Senator Joseph McCarthy.
I have in my hand checks.
The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it.
Edward R. Murrow's broadcast was the beginning of the end of McCarthyism. But the anti-communist investigations gave Richard Nixon anti-communist credentials, which would serve him well in future years. As World War II was ending, first Roosevelt and then Truman at Potsdam had tried to get the Soviets to open an Asian front against Japan. When the war was over and the Japanese were defeated, it was understood that Moscow was entitled to some of the spoils of war. But where? Not Japan. China was an ally. It was agreed that they would get a piece of Korea. But where would the line be drawn?
In the middle of the night one night, another colonel and I were sent into an adjoining room to propose a specific line, and we looked at a map of Korea, thought that it would be good if the capital, Seoul, were in our sector, so-called. So we looked north of Seoul, and there were no clear distinguishing geographic features that we could use, but there was the 38th parallel. And so we recommended the 38th parallel, and the Russians accepted that with alacrity, somewhat to our surprise. Well, neither the State Department nor military people who were present at that meeting knew that at the beginning of this century, the Russians and the Japanese had been negotiating about spheres of influence in Korea along the 38th parallel. Had we known that, we would have selected any other line, because that undoubtedly meant to the Russians that we were accepting their sphere of influence north of the 38th parallel, and that any talk about the unification of Korea was just froth on the cake. So it turned out to have been a mistake, partly through the ignorance of those present about the earlier history of the 38th parallel in Korea.
In neighboring China, a civil war had been going on for years between the communist Chinese and Washington's allies, the nationalist Chinese. There had been a lull of sorts during the war against Japan, but now the communists were positioned to take it all.
Those of us who'd had any experience in China knew that we could remobilize several million men and do nothing more than occupy a few coastal cities in China. There's no way that we can lay on a general war to stop communism or for any other purpose on the Chinese mainland.
Washington sent a number of soldier diplomats to China to see what could be done. General Albert Wiedemeyer was one of them.
At all times, it was impressed upon me that communism would be blocked in every way possible without creating a scene where military force would be necessary.
The idea was to create a coalition government, convince President Chiang Kai-shek to share power with the communists.
I said, General Marshall, I don't believe you can amalgamate these forces with the communists and the nationalists.
Former Congressman Walter Judd remembers a conversation with Chiang Kai-shek.
He said, why does your government have opposite policies with respect to our government from that which it has in Europe? You say to the countries over there, you must keep the communists out of your government. The whole Greek-Turkey program was based on the Greeks who you must get the communists out. And then you come to me and tell me you won't give our government unless we take the communists in.
But more to the point, Mao Zedong and his communist armies didn't need to share power. In October of 1949, they achieved total victory. In their moment of triumph, they asked for recognition from the United States. The message was carried by a junior diplomat, Han Shu, now Chinese ambassador to the United States.
After the proclamation of the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, I personally brought to Mr. Edelman Club, then the United States Consul General in Beijing, an announcement made by the Chinese government asking for recognition. But there was no response from the United States side.
One may say that very possibly we missed a political opportunity to establish a primary contact with Zhou Enlai that might have been more fruitful later.
A year later, Chinese and American troops would be fighting one another in Korea.
The Asiatic crisis point becomes Korea.
On June 25th, 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel. Within 2 days, they were on the outskirts of the South Korean capital, Seoul.
In evacuating the city of Seoul, I had taken out a shortwave radio with me, and the boys were operating that evening after I went to bed. And among other things, they were able to pick up the broadcast of President Truman's statement that he had decided to put American air and naval forces into action.
Truman had done more than simply order troops into action. This wasn't going to be an American war. This would be a police action by the forces of the United Nations against communist aggression. It happened that the Soviets were boycotting the UN Security Council, and so were not around. Brian Urquhart has been with the United Nations Secretariat for more than 30 years.
In that particular case, the United Nations, in the absence of the Soviet Union, took a decision which was, in fact, the policy of the United States. Certainly, well, I don't think that will ever happen again.
An American president had effectively gone to war without congressional approval. That would happen again. President Truman appointed General Douglas MacArthur commander of the United Nations forces. MacArthur succeeded brilliantly, pushing all the way to the Chinese border. He wanted to go on. The Chinese were watching closely. Hundreds of thousands of troops were ready to strike. Liang Quan-shui was one of them.
Every day in Chengdu, there were discussions. The topic was American imperialism, was just a paper tiger, and it was nothing, powerless.
Zhang Hongjin, a doctor, volunteered to join the Chinese army.
They said the Americans had already come to the Yalu River. They had crossed the Yalu River. They would be close to Atomen and coming to our territory into China. So they told us to go and help Korea.
We received a kind of warning through the Indian ambassador.
If the United States is going to cross the parallel and expand the war, and China will not sit back and with folded hands. But the United States government ignored the warning.
At Wake Island, General MacArthur told President Truman that he did not think the Chinese would intervene, but that if they did, there would be a mass slaughter at the Yalu River, that it wouldn't make much military difference even if they did. Well, and on both counts, we were wrong.
The Chinese, just as they had warned, streamed across the border, pushing the Americans back. American troops were caught off guard by the massive Chinese attack. Casualties among Marines who at one point were surrounded were extremely heavy. Finding himself overwhelmed, MacArthur stepped up his demand that the U.S. open a general war against China, even to the point of using nuclear weapons. Harry Truman recognized a reality that would haunt every American president to come. There were limits, even to U.S. power. MacArthur was adamant, taking his case directly to the American public. Truman fired him. It was not a popular move. MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome. Cheering crowds reflected the American appetite for clear victory. That there were limitations to what a superpower with an atomic arsenal could do was too frustrating. Without a war against China, a traditional victory in Korea was impossible. And if you couldn't fight to win against the communists, how would it ever end? What America had determined by now was that it wasn't going to return to isolationism. By 1952, we were in Europe, we were in Asia, and we were going to stay. Indeed, during the next 8 years, the Eisenhower administration would lead the battle to resist international communism. In a moment, Peter Jennings will return with that.
'45-85, America and the world since World War II. '45-85, brought to you by IBM, will continue in a moment.
You know, learning to read is tough. I learned back when I was 6, well, maybe 7. But these kids are already reading in kindergarten. It's because of this really neat learning program called Writing to Read. It's from IBM. Now, it takes words a kid can say, and they can say a lot, and teaches them how to write and read them.
J, turtle.
Turtle.
Type turtle.
E-U. The computer helps them. It's fun.
Can a fish ride in a wagon?
No.
3.
I got it. There's a lot of other stuff that's fun, too. More than 20,000 kids were part of the pilot program. And some can even write their own stories.
Dad cooks macaroni. I like it, too. It makes me happy when it is my birthday. And we read. It's fun reading. I kissed my cat before I went to school.
Gee, I wish they had this when I was a kid.
After 1 year in the program, the reading ability of the children as a group was significantly higher than the national norm. 7 out of 10 were writing words, sentences, even stories. The 2-year pilot program of Writing to Read was supported and funded by IBM. For more information, write IBM, Box 888, Armonk, New York.
To hit the right note on your personal computer, you've got to have the right personal printer. That's why IBM offers an ensemble of personal printers. For text, for color, for graphs, for pictures, for speed, for charts, for letter quality, for whatever you compose. IBM personal printers.
If you're thinking of buying a personal computer, and all the signs say it's time to take the first step, a few questions may still be holding you back. Will your PC have the power you want to run the software you want? What about expandability and optional equipment? And how much money is it going to take? If these questions have crossed your mind, now's a good time to look at IBM, the complete answer. An IBM PC can run the latest, most powerful programs and give you almost unlimited expandability with options like the new IBM printers and the IBM PC network. And today, prices are better than ever. So don't wait. Once you take the first step, the rest come easy. IBM personal computers. See them at a store near you or call your IBM representative.
Nick Fox, investigative reporter for Newspoint magazine. James Mackey, Nick's best friend and partner, key to the inside. Thomas Campbell and Stoney Jackson. Investigative reporters who know only one way to get a story. Become a part of it. The Insiders, premiering 1 week from tonight.
You'll love it.
A great many Americans today think of the 1950s as happy days, but as this model of Sputnik, the first Soviet satellite to orbit the Earth, reminds us, it was also in the 1950s that the Soviets began to catch up. In the early 50s, a great many Americans laughed at this German bug, but by the end of the 1950s, we were in love with the Volkswagen, particularly its gas mileage. It took Detroit a long time to catch up. In last week's mileage competition, a Chevrolet did come first, but its engine was built in Japan. In the 1950s, we were not quite as gripped with television as we are today. Do you know we don't make black and white television sets in America anymore? In the 1950s, at the beginning, this is what the television sets looked like. There were only 4 million sets in the country. By the end of the decade, there were 52 million. In the 1950s, Jonas Salk invented the polio vaccine, and millions of children were protected for the first time against polio. In the 1980s, we don't think very much about polio. We think about AIDS. You may have heard President Reagan at his news conference last night talking about how much government will contribute to AIDS research. Well, the critics think it is not enough. Here's a great first from the 1950s. The first McDonald's. In the Soviet-American competition, what Sputnik had shown us was that Soviets had a capacity to launch a missile and land it on the United States. You know what a great many Americans did? They ran out and they built themselves fallout shelters. And we were so concerned with communism far away from home that we hardly noticed Fidel Castro and the revolution in Cuba. Far away from home, we were concerned with war. The war in Korea was stalemated. We elected Dwight Eisenhower to end it, and he did. And this is the original armistice agreement that was signed between the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the United Nations at Panmunjom. The year was 1953. And this is where it ended. Panmunjom was a pretty famous place in the 1950s. They constructed a special building so the armistice could be signed. Because of some changes in the demilitarized zone, it is over there now on the North Korean side. The New York Times reporter here then said it was more like signing a declaration of war than it was a truce agreement.
The Peace Pagoda in Panmunjom. From your seat in this theater, you are an eyewitness to the step-by-step process of the beginning of the end of the fighting in Korea.
General William Harrison signed for the United Nations.
There were a lot of commies on the other end. They were all dressed up in their best uniforms. But I didn't believe in bowing and scraping to communists. So I just waited in my old suntans and didn't make any ceremony out of it at all. I just wasn't going to do it.
You can still feel the tension here at Panmunjom, and of course Korea is still divided. Down there in the south, 40,000 Americans still on duty, lest there ever be another invasion from the communist north. Korea was the first war that America had failed to win. It didn't lose either. And the reason the fighting stopped here was because of a threat from President Eisenhower. Shortly before his death, in several very candid conversations with friends and historians, the president reflected on many of the actions he'd taken while he was in the White House. And one of the things he did was to tell the North Koreans and the Chinese that if the fighting didn't stop here, he would widen the war and he'd use atomic weapons.
Either this armistice had to be signed and without any further dilly-dallying, or I was no longer going to be bound by the so-called gentlemen's agreements, and I was going to use whatever was necessary to win.
It was an effective threat. It was also the last time an American president would explicitly threaten to use atomic weapons. In 1953, atomic weapons were not unthinkable.
Eisenhower said to me, and I was deeply shocked, he said, "You British look upon the atomic weapon as something totally new. But you've got to remember, throughout history, new weapons have in due course become conventional weapons. The atomic bomb will soon become a conventional weapon. I must say my jaw dropped.
Washington's cavalier attitude would soon change. When the Soviets stepped up from the atomic to the hydrogen bomb, we began to realize that using these weapons might mean the other side using them too. Recognizing the need for a strategy to manage America's relations with the communists, President Eisenhower commissioned a study. Project Solarium was top secret for almost 30 years afterwards.
I think it probably was a result of sort of two factors. One, the death of Stalin, which took place fairly early within the first few months of the Eisenhower administration. And the second was Eisenhower's own instincts, I guess largely as a result of his military experience of liking to have staff analyses and discussions of potential problems or areas that were going to require action.
The president's advisors considered many options, including overthrowing the communist government in China, and even what the cost would be of a third world war. This paragraph from the Solarium Project's final report summed up what would be America's policy towards the communists for the next decade. The United States should take feasible political, economic, propaganda, and covert measures designed to create and exploit troublesome problems for the USSR. While the United States was settling for a draw in Korea, we were already becoming involved in Vietnam. One of America's World War II allies was on the verge of a disastrous defeat in a place called French Indochina.
Crisis in the Indochina War.
The French were fighting to hold on to their colonial empire. They were being beaten by Ho Chi Minh. The French were frustrated and decided to go for a quick victory. They chose a plain in northern Vietnam. For the French, it became hell in a very small place.
Casualties are heavy on both sides at Dien Bien Phu.
Americans would know a few years later what battlefield obstacles the Vietnamese could overcome. The Viet Minh, led by their commander, General Giap, came from hundreds of miles away, carrying with them tons of heavy artillery. They surrounded the French garrison. The siege lasted for months. The United States had been paying for 80% of the French war effort, but Eisenhower refused French pleas to save the garrison. He would not use American soldiers to perpetuate French colonialism. As glorified in this North Vietnamese film, Dien Bien Phu fell on May the 7th, 1954.
I think that the Dien Bien Phu victory was a historic victory that was very significant. Dien Bien Phu was a forging ground and also a place to gain experience on modern warfare, so that later on we could expand this to win victory in the fight against the American imperialists.
The defeated French troops were marched out of Dien Bien Phu, and French colonial domination in the region came to an end. The events in Indochina were a paradox. Eisenhower would not support an ally's colonial adventures, but communism in the region had to be checked, and the president believed that if it were not, one country after another could fall to the communists. Following a recorded news conference in 1954, it became known as the domino theory.
You have a row of dominoes set up, and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly.
Most of the dominoes were perceived to be here in Asia, and that is one reason the Eisenhower administration spent so much time helping to rebuild the economy of Japan. Washington believed that a democratic and economically powerful Japan would be a counterbalance to the communists in the region. Little did we think then that one day this Japanese economy would be such a powerful threat to our own. The first post-war Japanese products began to trickle onto the American market in the early 50s. Made in Japan then was another way of saying junk.
I once discussed with John Foster Dulles, and he told me that, well, Japan will have no opportunity to produce something which Japan could sell to the United States.
John Foster Dulles was wrong, and a young Japanese electrician, Akio Morita, set out to prove it. He made the decision during a visit to West Germany in 1953, when he found a small umbrella on a dish of ice cream.
I had ice cream, and on the ice cream, small bamboo umbrella was put on, and then waiter said, "This is from your country." I was very much disappointed because there's such a, umbrella on the ice cream represents Japan. So seeing this and hearing this, I made up my mind we should change the made in Japan. But we had a big problem that our company name, Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo. I found no American can pronounce that name correctly. That's why I thought that we cannot use such a bad name on our product. So we studied many different language and dictionaries, and we found in Latin, sonus, the sound, and English word sunny boy, S-O-N-N-Y. We thought we are a group of sunny boys and handling sound business, so we decided to make a short. We created S-O-N-Y.
S-O-N-Y, Sony. Sony didn't have much of a ring to it then. After all, in the 1950s, American technology was king.
Better made, more dependable, more nearly trouble-free than products made in any such quantities anywhere else in the world.
Introducing the American way of life on the threshold of the golden 60s. Color, style, comfort, utility, and convenience.
America was a consumer's paradise. The first business computers were in evidence. You could fly all the way across America in a jet now. You could go to the movies in 3D. The world had not yet been tied together by television, but America was fascinated.
Playhouse 90. Tonight starring Jack Palance.
In what novel, by what name, do the benevolent brothers appear?
The Cheerful Brothers in Nicholas Nicholson.
You're right for 32.
Yes, that's right. Elvis Presley.
You ain't
Television was not just entertainment.
Ted Huntley, NBC News, New York.
And David Brinkley, NBC News, Washington.
Good evening, everybody. Coast to coast, Douglas Edwards reporting. A slow-motion view.
Americans began to see world events and their president almost daily. The medium was still new. The political message from the administration was as cold as American-Soviet relations.
There is not a single country in this hemisphere which has not been penetrated by the apparatus of international communism acting under orders from Moscow.
The Soviet Union has got designs on the American hemisphere.
Stay out of this hemisphere and don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
Moscow did not heed the warning. Soviet-American competition would become global. Here in Egypt in 1956, President Eisenhower turned on three of America's allies. The French, the British, and the Israelis had invaded this place called Suez. They had decided that Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was a threat to their interests in the region. And they used as the pretext for their invasion the fact that Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal. President Eisenhower's actions marked the end of British and French dominance in the Middle East and the beginning of America's.
And so it was the French who finally dreamed up the idea of getting the Israelis to make a move and using the Israelis as a stalking horse so that the Israelis would attack towards the Suez Canal through the Sinai Peninsula. And we and the French would go in to stop the war, put out the fire, oh, here we are on the Suez Canal. How extraordinary. British and French troops in occupation. That was what was finally done, which of course involved everybody telling lies through their teeth to the House of Commons, to the French Parliament, and to the United Nations. And, of course, which was what particularly angered Eisenhower, to the Americans.
Once again, Eisenhower saw colonial powers trying to hang on. With the Suez Canal in ruins, he forced the British, the French, and the Israelis to end their occupation and withdraw.
There can be no peace without law. And there can be no law if we were to invoke one code of international conduct for those who oppose us and another for our friends.
Nasser didn't appreciate what we did to save him. He just got rougher in terms of our interest. But second, even important, it destroyed the British and the French as world powers. From that time on, Britain and France would not play a major role on the world scene.
As colonial domination dissolved in the Middle East, America would find itself filling the vacuum and trying to keep the Soviets out. In the 1950s, Moscow was making it clear that America could do nothing in Eastern Europe. And here in Berlin, we discovered that the Soviets had their own version of the domino theory. And they would move brutally to ensure that the first domino never fell. In the 1950s, in 3 Eastern European countries, there were movements for greater liberalization. The Kremlin made sure that they were crushed. In East Berlin, during June of 1953, thousands of workers rioted against Soviet domination. Martial law was invoked, Soviet troops moved in, 38 Berliners were killed and almost 400 injured. That Soviet domino didn't fall. In 1956, in the Polish city of Poznan, 30,000 Poles rebelled. At least 500 were killed, and that Soviet domino was secure. And then there was Hungary, the bloodiest revolution of them all. It began in the fall. Tens of thousands of Hungarians were killed. The United States would learn a hard lesson in the limitations of power.
It was a war. On the day the Russian onslaught started, November 4, it started early in the morning. It was still dark, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. Then they started to shell Budapest.
Attention, attention. This is Free Kossuth Radio Budapest. In the early hours of the morning, Soviet troops have started an attack against the Hungarian capital. Our troops are engaged in battle with the Soviet forces.
We were at home. I ran to the telephone to call the Associated Press in London. I reached the operator and I gave her, I said, connect me with London, this number. She was crying on the telephone. I can't connect you anymore. I can't. That's what she said.
It was a tragedy, and a tragedy to which we contributed. We contributed to it because some of our programs that were carried on radio in Hungary called for the Hungarian people to rise up. I think many of them got the impression that we would come to their assistance. It was a terribly difficult decision for Eisenhower not to do so. But he looked at the situation, and the situation was that the Soviet Union had overwhelming conventional superiority in the area. So what is our answer to Hungary? To bomb Moscow? Eisenhower had to make that decision and decided that it would not be credible for him to threaten to do so.
The United States does now, and never has, advocate open rebellion by an undefended populace against force, over which they could not possibly prevail.
And so, with the events in Hungary, the United States had accepted that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviets could do whatever they liked. America America was so preoccupied with communism overseas, we didn't give much thought to the possibility of communism 90 miles away. In 1959, when Fidel Castro overthrew a Cuban dictatorship and marched into Havana, many Americans thought he was a genuine Democrat.
Bueno, este fue un día muy grande, día de mucha alegría.
That was a great day, a day of great happiness. For us, the struggle represented a delivery of ourselves to the Cuban people. We were idealistic revolutionaries.
I think it was the winter of 59-60 that Castro paid a visit to the United Nations. At that time, we were aware of communists among his entourage, of communist influence on him, but we still held out the hope that if he was properly briefed about it, he could be persuaded to remain a non-communist. As a matter of fact, although it's not, I think, widely known, an agency operative actually was sent up, identified as such, to meet him in New York and have a secret meeting with him to brief him on the communists in his own entourage. We were profoundly naive.
The Soviet Union was also uncertain about Castro. But if he could be wooed, the Soviets might have an important asset in America's backyard. During that same session of the United Nations, the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, saw an opportunity. Castro had been snubbed by a downtown New York hotel and had gone to stay in Harlem. Khrushchev paid him a visit. After he was deposed in the 1960s, Nikita Khrushchev recorded his memoirs on audio tape. And this is one of the audio tapes. There were 180 hours of them. They were taken out of the Soviet Union. They made their way to Time Incorporated. And Time ultimately gave them to the Russian Institute at Columbia University here in New York. They have never been heard publicly until now. On this one, Khrushchev remembers why he went to visit Castro.
Я запросил наше представительство, чтобы связались по телефону с Кастро.
I felt it would be better for me to make the first visit. This would underline our solidarity with Cuba, especially in light of the indignation and discrimination they were being subjected to. Secondly, the Cuban delegation was in Harlem, and the owner of the hotel was a Negro. By going to a Negro hotel in a Negro district, we would be making a double demonstration against the discriminatory policies of the United States of America towards Negroes, as well as toward Cuba.
Not long after that, Castro would declare himself a communist, and the Cold War would come to America's doorstep. It would take a while for most Americans to notice. They were busy having a good time.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on, join me home. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes 1. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. When the clock strikes 2, 3, and 4, the band slows down, we'll yell for more. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock strikes 12, we'll cool off and start rocking around the clock again. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
But while Americans were busy trying to master a simple circle of plastic, the Soviets were circling the globe with a man-made satellite. In October 1957, we learned they had beaten us into space.
The first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created. This full satellite was today successfully launched in the USSR.
it was a most tremendous shock. It showed us that the Soviets could use a missile to land a weapon on the United States from Soviet territory, just that. And at that time, it would not have been possible for the United States to have replied.
At Cape Canaveral, Florida, a Vanguard rocket is ready to launch America's first Sputnik into space. But rockets are unpredictable things, and our slow-motion camera records how an undetected fault in the first stage of the rocket turned the launching into calamity. Not fatal, but disappointing.
From the President's office in the White House in Washington, D.C., we present an address by the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Earth satellites in themselves have no direct present effect upon the nation's security. However, there is real military significance to these launchings.
President Eisenhower was determined to catch up militarily. We would also put a man in space.
These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
In this race with the Soviets, the astronauts would become the new American heroes. In much of the world, America needed fresh heroes. The American image of a peace-loving nation was under attack. Soviet policy was to exploit every situation, to divide America from her European allies. And in the spring of 1960, we helped them. An American U-2, a high-altitude spy plane, was brought down in the Soviet Union. And America lied about it.
The department has been informed by the NASA that, as announced May 3, an unarmed plane, a U-2 weather research plane based at Adana, Turkey, piloted by a civilian, has been missing since May 1.
That turned out to be a mistake. We, of course, assumed that he was dead. Whether of the crash, whether he'd been shot down or whether it was a malfunction of the system, we suspected that he would not have survived.
Not only did Francis Gary Powers survive, but he was a prisoner, and the Soviets would soon produce him. It was a golden opportunity for Nikita Khrushchev, and he used it.
We smiled with pleasure as we anticipated the discomfort which the spies who cooked up this false statement would feel when confronted with the evidence we already had in our pocket.
Now, make no mistake, I was sure that sooner or later we're going to have a U-2, we're going to have this whole thing discovered. But the information we were getting was so valuable that I continued.
2 or 3 days later, after they talked themselves out and got thoroughly wound up in this unbelievable story, we decided to tell the world what had really happened. We laid out everything just as it had occurred. The Supreme Soviet heard my report with great wrath and jubilation.
Well, when I saw what a terrible mess this lie had made of the thing, but it was a lie, of course, I just said, well, now, look, here's the truth about the thing, and I did it, and that's that. When you get your fingers caught in the cookie jar, there's no use of pretending that you were out in the stable somewhere.
Успехом строить коммунистическое общество! Идет вперед к коммунизму!
And so the Eisenhower era ended on a note of embarrassment for the United States. In the Soviet-American competition, the Soviets were catching up. America was no longer the unchallenged giant that had stood alone at the end of 1945. Maybe it was time for a change.
The question before us all, that faces all Republicans and all Democrats, is, can freedom in the next generation conquer, or are the communists going to be successful? That's the great issue. And if we meet our responsibilities, I think freedom will conquer. If we fail to move ahead, if we fail to develop sufficient military and economic and social strength here in this country, then I think that the tide could begin to run against us. And I don't want historians 10 years from now to say, these were the years when the tide ran out for the United States. I want them to say, these were the years when the tide came in. These were the years when the United States started to move again.
The American image was tarnished. We had acknowledged that the Iron Curtain was a permanent fixture in Europe. We'd been beaten to the draw in space. we certainly had not accepted the idea of living with a communist nation so close to our shores as Cuba was. When we come back, Ted Koppel will tell us where President Kennedy took the nation, into the 60s and beyond.
'45-85, America and the world since World War II. This special presentation of 45-85 is brought to you by IBM.
In the Eastern Caribbean, a hurricane threatens everyone in its path.
It was one of those days you could feel there was sort of silence sometimes in the air.
Wind start blowing. Everybody starts shouting to one another, leaving their home and going. Nobody knows where they're going.
A hurricane is the most devastating thing I've ever seen. Just one hurricane can destroy our economy and set us back a whole generation.
To aid people in the Caribbean, Dr. Percival Perry, an IBM scientist, returned to the island home where he was born.
I wanted to set up a computerized satellite tracking system in the Eastern Caribbean so people in this region can get early disaster warnings about hurricanes.
To help build the storm warning system, IBM donated several computers and a year of Dr. Perry's time.
We get good information from the National Weather Center in Miami, but we can always use more. With Dr. Perry's antenna and the IBM computer, we will be able to look at information in greater detail in the immediate vicinity of the islands.
As a result of this project, we've been able to bring computers to Antigua in a way that was not imagined before. This project is just the start, my way of helping, and it was very satisfying to me.
Dr. Perry's project is one example of how IBM is contributing the time and talents of its people in hundreds of communities throughout the United States and around the world. You're about to spend a day on the campus of UCLA. There's something exciting going on here, something that's happening on campuses all across the country, something that's affecting America's future.
There's been a revolution in which the computer has been the leading edge. And this has been pushing the revolution in teaching. There isn't a single area on this campus which has not profited from the use of computers.
A lot of students come to UCLA who are very bright, they did well in high school, but for one reason or another, their writing skills are below average. We developed a writing package, a computer program that would address their needs. And as a result of that, these students are enthusiastic about writing.
This is the way that architects have worked for centuries, by drawing buildings very carefully, by hand. Now, computer graphics changes all of that completely because it takes a great deal of the labor out of the process. Like any professor, I'm interested in the spirit and the sense of excitement that students have in their work. Computer graphics brings that because it's a new medium and because it opens up completely new vistas that the students haven't experienced before.
We are excavating an ancient city in Syria, and one of the most interesting ways in which we are using the computer is for a visual reconstruction of the buildings. In a very real sense, the computer is helping us to bring the past back to life.
There is a feeling among some people that computers push people apart, but that isn't true. On the contrary, I look at our own students and I see what camaraderie, what friendship, what new way of working the computer has brought for them. When I was a young student, we used to think how we would change the world. And as I see my new students, of course, they also want to do that. But now, with the aid of computers, maybe they can.
Hundreds of universities are receiving IBM grants for computers, course development, and research. What's happening at UCLA is one example of how business and education can work together to create new ways of learning.
Walter Payton and the Bears take on the Vikings in an NFL special Thursday night. AIDS, Virus of Fear, all next week on ABC's World News Tonight. The 60s and into the 70s, a time of trial for America, when 45-85 continues.
Look who's sitting tall in the saddle. It's Webster. Yeah, and he's heading for the wildest dude ranch out west. You'll love the 1-hour season premiere Friday at 8, 7 Central.
In Italy,
When the soccer game is on, everything comes to a stop. Except for one thing. We call it Priazzo, Italian pie. Baked fresh every day, only at Pizza Hut.
Time is running out. Our stock-up countdown is on now, with better than ever savings on all your favorite groceries. Look!
Betty Crocker layer cake mixes are just 66 cents each. Wilson Original or Hawaiian just for us boneless hams are only $4.99 each. And Robert's Regular or low-fat cottage cheese is just 88 cents a carton.
But hurry! Time is running out!
It's IGA's stock-up countdown.
Every time I pick you up, you bring me down so low. It's starting to show. Viva, you're good and low. You're much too fresh. You're too darn smooth that I can't say no, no, no. Viva, you're good and low.
We're Beatrice.
A look at high school football.
Our philosophies in this age of Aquarius in the 60s and into the early 70s were reduced to buttons and bumper stickers. Make love, not war. Tune in, turn on, drop out. And an entire generation of young Americans found its identity on a New York farm one famous summer weekend near a place called Woodstock. Old familiar words took on new meaning. Grass, pot, gay, acid. And old familiar privileges that we assumed to be part of our American birthright evaporated overnight. Cheap gasoline? Not after the Arab oil embargo. There was a time when gas was 29 cents a gallon, but never again. But this was also the time when Neil Armstrong set his indelible footsteps on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Here on Earth, meanwhile, we were in the middle of a revolution, a sexual revolution, explained by just two words, the pill. In the 1970s, no one had to explain what the tapes meant either. The Watergate tapes meant the end of the Nixon presidency. And much of all this had grown once again out of our efforts to stem the spread of communism. God only knows how many American troops carried this icon of that era, the M16, into the rice paddies of Vietnam. And yet the 60s had started off on such a buoyant note, the inauguration of a new president. When John F. Kennedy took the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol building back in 1961, there was a feeling that America was embarking on a fresh new course. We had a young, vibrant president and a beautiful first lady. From the image point of view, it was almost as though America had its own royal family.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
He was idolized by millions of Americans, but to world leaders, John Kennedy was an inexperienced, untested commodity.
Just after Kennedy was elected, I happened to see Prime Minister Macmillan in London, and he wanted to know more about Kennedy, because he said, you know, I had such a good relationship with President Eisenhower. We knew each other during the war. We looked at the world more or less in the same way. We enjoyed each other's company. And now there is this young, cocky Irishman, he called him.
Kennedy knew he was being tested. It shaped his rhetoric from the very first day.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill,
that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Well, it was the besetting sin of American leaders to allow their speechwriters to put rhetoric far ahead of any reality whatever. And in his case, it was the rhetoric of freedom, which meant treating the communists as baddies who were going to be defeated all over the world.
One anti-communist operation was inherited from the Eisenhower administration. Yosepa Island, just a few miles from Fort Myers, Florida, had been leased lock, stock, and barrel by the CIA. They wanted a private spot to interview, evaluate, and train some Cuban exiles who would, only 88 days into the Kennedy administration, lead an assault against Fidel Castro in Cuba. It was the first and biggest foreign policy disaster of the Kennedy presidency.
Mario Cabello was a member of the invasion squad.
Then again, when we reached the Bay of Pigs, we were sitting ducks. We started receiving Castro's air bombardments. The Castro's planes started attacking us, and we were eventually sunk. And my battalion was almost completely annihilated. The air cover promise and never deliver was the key to the invasion's failure, in my view.
Miles away in the serenity of Camp David, President Kennedy and former President Eisenhower confer on the repercussions of the Cuban episode. General Eisenhower promises bipartisan support for the president in this crisis, support reiterated by Richard Nixon and other Republican leaders.
Eisenhower, as was my case, never criticized what happened in the Bay of Pigs publicly, but he was vehement privately. He said, he used to grit his teeth when he felt something. You know, Dick, I would never have approved a plan without air cover.
Well, to my mind, it was the greatest mistake of his political career. First, because he undertook this action, and second, because he lost it.
Less than 2 months after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy was set to meet Nikita Khrushchev at a summit in Vienna. The Soviet leader was belligerent.
Mr. Khrushchev wound up by delivering in a very bold and intimidating way an ultimatum on Berlin. He said to Kennedy, now we're going to do this as far with the East Germans. Your access to Berlin will have to be worked out with the East Germans. If there is any attempt by the West to interfere with these arrangements, there will be war. Well, now in diplomacy, you almost never use the word war. And Kennedy had to look at him straight in the eye and say, well, then, Mr. Chairman, there's going to be war.
But Khrushchev, in part, I think, with judgment colored by his memories of the debacle of the Bay of Pigs, believed Kennedy was weak.
In response, Kennedy tried to show Khrushchev that he was tough. He called for beefed-up troop strength in Europe, posturing for a possible confrontation with the Soviets.
Soviet strategy has long been aimed not merely at Berlin, but at dividing and neutralizing all of Europe, forcing us back on our own shores. We must meet our often stated pledge to the free peoples of West Berlin.
West Berlin, located in the heart of East Germany, had become an irresistible magnet. August 12th, 1961. On that day alone, the biggest flood of refugees in years. 4,000 fled from East to West Berlin. On August 13th, the border was sealed. Dr. Rainer Hildebrandt escaped to West Berlin.
At
the beginning, it had been sealed off only with barbed wire. And then many thought, dear God, maybe we can flee through Bernauer Straße, because over the entire length of the street, the walls of the houses are the borders. So that when you're in the house, you're in the east. But if you jump from the window, you're in the west.
A few days later, the bricks and mortar appeared.
Khrushchev told me I had to build this wall. He said there was a hemorrhage. We were losing all the best people in East Germany. I couldn't let that go on. I had to stop those people from going to the West, and so I had to build that wall.
After the wall was built, the Cold War threatened to get hot. The Soviets moved 300,000 Warsaw Pact troops into East Germany. By late October, U.S. and Soviet tanks were facing each other across the border. Both sides had talked war. Neither was prepared to pull the trigger. The Berlin crisis ended in a standoff. Although Khrushchev did indicate that the Soviets would take no immediate action to cut off West Berlin, Kennedy still felt he was being tested.
He lost in an embarrassing way at the Bay of Pigs. His first meeting with Khrushchev didn't go well. He was having trouble in Berlin. And I think he'd come to the end of his patience and, frankly, to the end of what he thought he could do in terms of the domestic political situation. He had to stand firm in his mind in Vietnam.
Kennedy decided to make Vietnam a priority. He placed new emphasis on a counterinsurgency unit. 400 of these special forces, the Green Berets, were sent to Vietnam to reinforce the nearly 700 U.S. advisors already in place at the end of the Eisenhower administration. President Ngo Dinh Diem was increasingly turning to Washington in his fight against the communists, the Viet Cong.
On October 16, 1962, the president summoned me to his office. He told me that Soviet nuclear missiles had been identified on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from our shore.
Over the next 13 days, Soviet testing of Kennedy and his advisors pushed events closer to the brink of nuclear war than ever before or since.
And when he walked into the room to join the rest of us, he looked around the table and said with a little smile, "Well, gentlemen, today we're going to earn our pay."
Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State, was called in as an outside consultant. He recommended an airstrike against the missiles in Cuba. Someone said to him, "Mr. Secretary, what will the Soviets do in response?" "Oh, I know the Soviets pretty well," he said, "from dealing with them over the years. I think they will then feel obligated to launch an attack and knock out our missiles in Turkey. And what will we then do, Mr. Secretary?" "Well," he said, "under the NATO treaty, we would then be obligated to knock out Soviet missile sites inside the Soviet Union." "Well, what will they then do, Mr. Secretary?" "Well," he said, "we hope by that time cooler heads will prevail and everybody will talk." Fortunately, we did not take his advice.
He decided, on the recommendation of myself and Bob McNamara, Bobby Kennedy, and some others, to use the quarantine method to blockade offensive weapons coming into Cuba.
All ships would be stopped and searched for missile parts. Kennedy, the nation, and the world waited.
And I remember what we had, was a chicken and white wine, and the president having chicken and milk and mashed potatoes. And Bobby came back after seeing the Russian ambassador, and all the news is bad. And I continue to eat nervously, unaware the two brothers had stopped talking. And then I heard that great voice go, "Dave, you are eating the chicken and drinking the wine like it is your last supper." And I look up embarrassed and said, "Mr. President, after listening to you and Bobby, I'm not quite so sure."
The Soviet ships turned around. The missile sites were disassembled. Faced with Kennedy's tough response, Khrushchev had backed down. It was, for the Kremlin, a public humiliation.
So it was two things. One is a feeling of humiliation, and another is determination to go on with these serious military programs as to achieve real parity or real military power.
I think both we and the Russians came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis somewhat more prudent than we had been before, because each side had had a chance to look down the cannon's mouth and did not like what we saw.
The Cold War continued, but for both sides it had been a sobering experience. At American University in June of 1963, the tough, unyielding rhetoric of Kennedy's inaugural address gave way to a call for a nuclear test ban treaty.
It would place the nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively
with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms.
Within 2 months, the U.S., Soviet Union, and Britain concluded a nuclear test ban treaty. Nuclear war had to be avoided. Some turning points in history are marked by a speech, others by an event. The early 1960s were marked by just such a series of events, and later, such a speech.
We are white people. We don't want them to go to school with me.
Segregation now and segregation forever.
This is the fulfillment of a dream.
I still have a dream.
Yes.
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream.
It may have been a uniquely American dream, but it inspired millions worldwide.
I was very close to the late Martin Luther King Jr., very close indeed. My impression of that movement was that it was going to have very positive effects on Africa.
In 1964, Kaunda would become, and remains to this day, president of the newly independent nation of Zambia. Between 1960 and 1963, 25 African nations gained independence. The United States sent Peace Corps volunteers to Africa and more troops to Vietnam. By the fall of 1963, the United States was becoming increasingly disenchanted with Ngo Dinh Diem's leadership in Vietnam. Washington was spending $500 million a year. 17,000 troops were in Vietnam, and President Kennedy was beginning to see political liabilities.
I remember making the announcement myself at a briefing in the White House that we were going to pull out 2,000 or 3,000 of our advisors. And I know that Kennedy was coming around rapidly to the point of view that what we needed was a political solution in Vietnam.
We'll never know. On November 1st, 1963, there was a coup in South Vietnam. The Kennedy administration had given its tacit approval. President Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother and chief political advisor, Ngo Dinh Nhu, were assassinated.
So it made him look like if he walked out right after the assassination of Diem and Nhu, it would have looked that he was soft on communism, especially since it looked like the Republican candidate might be Senator Goldwater. And it might be the only issue in the campaign.
But only 3 weeks later.
Repeating this bulletin received at WQMR from the United Press. A sniper has fired at President Kennedy.
The president, cradled in his wife's arms, rushed in his blood-spattered limousine by the Secret Service to Parkland Hospital. And then we had word that as the priests came out of the emergency room, they said, the President of the United States is dead.
I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
I was on Air Force One with him when we came home in that bleak homecoming with the flag-draped coffin of the 35th president in the after portion of Air Force One. And that night, Johnson painted on a canvas the Great Society, though at that night we didn't know it had a name. The name came in May of 1964, some 6 months later.
For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society.
Over the months and years that followed, Johnson promoted, and the Congress passed, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, the Economic Opportunity Act, the Voting Rights Act. It was an incredible agenda for social change. But like Kennedy before him, Johnson was sure he would have to be tough abroad to justify liberal policies at home.
Lyndon Johnson
grew to political maturity under Roosevelt and then Truman. And anybody who had been in public office, any Democrat who'd been in public office during the 40s, knew that there was a high price to pay for being soft on communism.
In January of 1964, General William Westmoreland was sent to Vietnam.
I told Mr. McNamara, I says, Mr. Secretary, we have a formidable task here. It's very difficult to see the end of it. I think it's going to try the patience of the American people, and I just wonder if they've got the staying power.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Democrats were sure that Goldwater would turn Vietnam into a major campaign issue. So once again, domestic politics would have its impact on American foreign policy. President Johnson felt that he had to take a strong stand in Vietnam. On August 4th, 1964, he found the pretext. An American destroyer, he reported, had been attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats in international waters.
It is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
But there may have been much less to the Tonkin Gulf incident than President Johnson suggested. It was later revealed that the destroyer Maddox had been hit by a single bullet during the first attack. The second attack may never have happened at all. But Johnson wanted a congressional go-ahead for reprisal, and he got it.
And it was in that context that all but 2 members of the United States Senate and everyone in the House went along with this request to uphold the president's action. The other thing that was in my mind as a Democrat is that Goldwater, who was then about to launch his final bid for the presidency against Johnson, was running on a platform that Johnson needed to show some muscle out there in Vietnam.
The undeclared war was escalating. By 1965, the first combat troops, 3,500 Marines, came ashore to protect the airport at Da Nang. America was fighting to protect Vietnam from falling to the communists. And one of our major misperceptions about Vietnam was that China was directing the war from Beijing.
Over this war and all Asia is another reality. The deepening shadow of communist China. The rulers in Hanoi are urged on by Peking.
We, and I include myself in this, did not fully appreciate the historic antagonism between the ethnic Vietnamese and the Chinese. The Vietnamese didn't want the Chinese down there because the last time they came down, it took them 1,000 years to get them out.
And China itself was in the midst of Chairman Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, a national convulsion that weakened its position as an international power. It ripped apart the internal fabric of Chinese society. The streets were filled with chanting radicals, reverent Maoists, and the fanatical Red Guard.
It was a bad dream. It was unbelievable. You see, today you were right. Tomorrow you became the counter-revolutionary. So I saw the people use machine gun to shoot each other in the streets.
It only widened the gap that existed between the Soviets and the Chinese. But America still believed it was fighting the communist monolith.
I remember always Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State at the time. When we spoke of Vietnam, we always repeated the bloc, not having even considered the fact that China and Russia at the time were beginning the worst enemies in the world.
And it would be years before the United States would take advantage of that split between the Chinese and the Soviet Union. The year, 1967. The establishment was under attack on all fronts.
Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, sir, I am.
Plastics.
When the music wasn't exalting the pleasures of drugs, it was exhorting people to protest.
I think there was a feeling of resolve. 67 was about grim business, and it was about people dying.
And our allies, who by now had anti-American protests in their streets, couldn't understand our fixation with Vietnam.
Country after country after country, we found they did not view the contest in Vietnam in the same light that we did. They did not see it as an expansion of Soviet or Chinese communism in Southeast Asia. They looked at it more as a civil war going on in Vietnam. To put it succinctly, they did not accept the Eisenhower domino theory that had been the basis of our participation.
But everything that had happened during the 1960s up to that point would seem tame in 1968. On college campuses, ghetto streets, in the Soviet bloc, and on the battlefields of Vietnam, 1968 would be the year it all came apart. And we'll be back with that in a moment.
4585, brought to you by IBM, will continue in a moment.
Space is there, and the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
In the very early days of the space program, we had a lot of failures. It wasn't unusual to see an Atlas come up off the pad and explode and burn in its own wake. When we saw those things, we began to think, what are we going to do in that situation when we have a man on top of it? When we started thinking about people who are going to fly our machines and decided to call an astronaut, then what qualities do you want in that human being? We immediately said we want test pilots, people who are willing to put their lives on the line every day. As the space program became more complex, you have to have a computer to aid man in making decisions on how to carry out the mission. There's no field of science, no field of technology that has not been touched by the results of the space program. And the facts are we've just begun to scratch the surface. I think it's more exciting than it's ever been.
From the early unmanned missions to the space shuttle, IBM people and IBM computers have played an important part in every space flight. And even after 25 years and more than 1 trillion miles, the adventure has just begun.
You're about to enter the world of a new technology called X-ray microscopy. Developed by IBM research scientists to advance computer technology, it brought them close inside this computer chip, discovering details no one had ever seen before. The scientists then wondered what they would see if they examined blood cells the same way. What they saw fascinated medical researchers. They discovered structures within the living human cell never seen before. A number of medical researchers have already used this new technology to examine sickle cells and cancer cells. X-ray microscopy, an example of how IBM research can contribute not only to business, but to life itself.
You're looking at a tiny dot of neon argon gas.
IBM has been working with a technology using thousands of these dots of light. The result, an ultra-thin computer display screen. But this thin screen is just the beginning. IBM research scientists are exploring new ways to use this technology.
Hi.
Amazing.
As you can see, we can talk face-to-face wherever our offices may be.
So I see.
And before, we could only display this much information. Now we can display this much more and do it from 4 different computers.
4 computers?
You can even make your own notations.
Where?
Right on the screen.
Oh.
And because the screen is so thin, you can put it anywhere, even on the wall.
Looks like it can do just about everything for an office. Except make a cup of coffee.
How's this?
The latest innovation in display screen technology, developed by IBM.
Meet Detectives McCarran and Rado.
Let's take on the world.
Taking their best shot at the wildest beat in town.
Doesn't it get to you? Yeah. And say something then. Let it out.
Premiering Saturday at 8, 7 Central.
You should get into antiques, Jack.
Drop in on the Hollywood Beat.
You'll love it.
January 31st, 1968. Shattering a truce that they had previously agreed to, the Viet Cong launched the massive multi-pronged Tet Offensive against targets in the south.
I was sleeping. It was about 2:30 in the morning, I think, in this little room on the 4th floor of our embassy in downtown Saigon, when all of a sudden there was a loud explosion. So loud that it literally shook everything that was in this room. But I quickly realized that we were being attacked.
Tet, which came as such a shock to the United States, had been masterminded here in this room. What Churchill's London bunker or Roosevelt's Oval Office was to the planning and prosecution of the Second World War, this modest little office was to the Vietnam War. This was where Ho Chi Minh formulated his plans. He died in 1969, almost 6 years before Hanoi's troops marched into Saigon. But North Vietnam's leaders today insist that following the Tet Offensive of 1968, Ho Chi Minh was already convinced that the war was won.
I think in the Tet Offensive, we could not succeed in our military targets. That means to capture Saigon, for instance. But we did succeed in showing to our people and to our army and to the American army and to the whole world that the defense of the GI, U.S. Army, is vulnerable. It was very important strategically.
We blew the North Vietnamese away. They lost 40,000 men plus in that engagement. But in politics, as in real life, perception is reality. And what people saw on the television tube was perception, but it was also real to them. When you see Viet Cong 4 feet, 10 feet from the door of the U.S. Embassy before they were finally killed, somebody said, my God, if they can get that close to the embassy, the war's over.
What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs.
If we had seen 50,000 people demonstrating around the headquarters in Hanoi, calling for peace, we would have thought the war was over. And we might have been right. Well, they could see 50,000 people demonstrating around the Pentagon. So I think that those dissenters in this country, whatever their motivations, in effect said to Hanoi, just hang in there, gentlemen, and you will win politically what you could not win militarily.
As Andropov once mentioned at the Politburo meeting at which I was present, that the war would be won by, not in Vietnam, but in the streets of American cities.
6 weeks after the Tet Offensive, polls were showing Johnson's approval rating had dropped from 48 to 36%. Anti-war Senator Eugene McCarthy made a strong showing in the New Hampshire presidential primary, and Senator Robert Kennedy entered the presidential race as well. On March 31st, 1968, just 2 months after the Tet Offensive, Johnson planned a speech to announce a new bombing halt as an incentive to peace. The speech had a surprise ending.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The Vietnam War had claimed yet another of its victims, President Lyndon Baines Johnson.
I went to see him after I was nominated for the presidency in '72. I called on him at his ranch in Texas. And one thing that struck me as he met me at the plane is that his hair was down to his shoulders. He'd let it grow just like the hippie kids. Here was a man for years had done battle with the so-called hippie generation, and yet one of the first things he did after leaving the White House was to let his hair grow so that he was on the same level with them.
America, racked with violence and protest, seemed to have gone mad. First, Dr. Martin Luther King, murdered on a Memphis motel balcony. That touched off an orgy of arson, looting, and lawlessness that claimed at least 31 lives. And 2 months later...
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
We've heard an alarming report that Robert Kennedy was shot in that ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles.
It seemed as if the fabric of America was unraveling. Americans associated the turmoil of 1968 with Lyndon Johnson, and Hubert Humphrey campaigned for the presidency, weighed down by his association with an unpopular president. They turned to a man they had defeated 8 years earlier.
Let all nations know that during this administration, our lines of communication will be open. We seek an open world.
Nixon had run as a peacemaker and a statesman, not the scrappy anti-communist of earlier years. He had promised to bring us together, and there was talk of a secret plan to end the war. But was there a secret plan?
No. That was one of those figments that, of the imagination that always comes up in the campaign. I made it clear during the campaign that I had some definite ideas about what to do once I came into office. The only way you could really win the war would be for the South Vietnamese to develop the capability of winning themselves so that they could defend it once we left. That was what I had in mind.
The Soviet Union was having massive problems as well. One of its satellites, Czechoslovakia, was experimenting with a liberalization of the Soviet brand of communism. It became known as the Prague Spring.
The beginning, which was essential one, was that we allowed ordinary people to express themselves in the radio, in the television.
On August 21st, an elite force of Soviet bloc troops moved into Czechoslovakia with lightning swiftness to crush the liberalization of the party. It was the first articulation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which held that Moscow would use military force against any moves towards self-determination. The 60s were coming to a close.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
The 70s were about to begin.
So I'd like to know where you got the notion. Said I'd like to know where you got the notion. Rock the boat, don't rock the boat, baby. Rock the boat, don't tip the boat over. Rock the boat, don't rock the boat, baby. Rock the boat.
There were lasting, more horrifying images as well. We saw a terrified child running down a road after a napalm attack in South Vietnam.
But very fortunately, my legs were not injured, and after I was completely burned and I noticed that my body was wounded, I was very scared. But I continued to run on for about another kilometer, And at that point, I passed out, and people took me to the hospital.
Richard Nixon began to talk peace, beginning with secret talks with the North Vietnamese. But he had also widened the war. In 1969, he began the bombing of communist sanctuaries in Cambodia. And when the bombing proved ineffective, he also launched a ground assault over the Cambodian border. With it, the fight against the war widened as well. College campuses exploded in a new round of protests. On May 4th, 1970, the war claimed its first domestic casualties. National Guardsmen opened fire on demonstrators at Kent State University in Ohio. Nixon, under siege by the war and the protest, had so far been unable to end the war or the protest. But he achieved another of his long-standing goals. Capitalizing on the deep rift between the Soviets and the Chinese, he made an historic breakthrough to establish new relations with China.
And part of the reason was that in the Kennedy and Johnson years, even if they had realized it, it would have been difficult for them as Democrats to do it. My anti-communist credentials helped me do it.
So dramatic as the United States decision made it might appear, the inner logic was there, and the trend was irreversible.
China was there. It was big, it was old, and it was going to play a great role in the world. Not in this century, necessarily, but in the next without question. Better to make your deal now rather than later.
3 months later, Nixon made diplomatic history again, as the first president since the Cold War to visit the Soviet Union. American forces were bombing and mining a Soviet ally, North Vietnam. Still, Nixon gambled that the Soviets would go ahead with the summit meeting anyway.
It was definitely not a simple decision. You might know that a special session of the Central Committee was called to decide whether to go to the summit or not. And we consulted our allies and our Vietnamese friends as well. And we considered the summit to be more important, or to give more to our relations than, well, not going to it.
Nixon's gamble on personal summitry again paid off. The result was SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It marked one of those occasional thaws in the Cold War when traditional hostility gives way to mutual interest. In this case, détente. It had the additional advantage of isolating North Vietnam as well. Then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was negotiating a treaty to end the war.
We had a summit with the Soviet Union, but shortly thereafter anyway, the whole atmosphere changed, became much more conciliatory.
Richard Nixon was still trying to get America out of Vietnam. 2 weeks before the election, Henry Kissinger had come home with a momentous announcement.
We believe that peace is at hand.
But after Nixon's landslide election victory, a ceasefire proved elusive. American air power was once again called in over North Vietnam. 2 weeks later, it was announced that Henry Kissinger and his North Vietnamese counterpart, Le Duc Tho, would begin talking again.
They wouldn't greet me at the door. They wouldn't shake hands with me in public. But inside, they were exuberantly friendly. And I thought that Le Duc Tho had discovered some hidden physical attraction for me. He couldn't keep his hands off me. And it was an extremely friendly atmosphere, and it was absolutely clear that they had come to settle.
But with those Paris Accords, we won a very fundamental victory. The entire American army and the American satellites had to withdraw completely from South Vietnam. That was a most fundamental victory for us, because once the American army had completely withdrawn from South Vietnam, it would be very difficult for the Americans to return.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
But revelations about the growing Watergate scandal were casting a new shadow of dishonor over the presidency, and Americans watched it unfold on television in the summer of 1973.
I began by telling the president
that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
I was aware of listening devices. Republicans do not go ahead and commit illegal acts.
Maybe my standards are all haywire.
I see no redeeming features in Watergate.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The impact of Watergate on foreign policy was a disaster. We were closer to Peking and Moscow than they were to each other. We had isolated Vietnam. We had good relations with Europe. We had a lot of options open to us. You cannot, however, exercise your options if you have no authority. And Watergate gradually diminished the authority of the president.
In October of 1973, when Egypt staged a stunning surprise attack on Israel, the uncertainty over Richard Nixon's authority would help raise the tensions to nuclear brinksmanship. The Soviets threatened to intervene.
Many observers believe that Brezhnev played the hard line that he did in the Yom Kippur War when he threatened to intervene unilaterally because he thought that I was wounded and that I would not react.
Soviet forces began maneuvers on their home soil, as if assembling for a Mideast expedition. American forces, including nuclear, went on worldwide alert.
It was implicit that in the event that they did move in, we would have to react. And under the circumstances, if we did react, you always had to consider that it might go to the ultimate weapon.
Once again, a U.S. president confronted the Soviets with a military threat. And once again, they backed down before tensions reached critical mass. But the Arab world was holding America responsible for Egypt's eventual defeat at the hands of the Israelis.
ABC News has learned that the administration is looking at several possible gasoline rationing plans.
All service stations are going to limit gasoline sales to 10 gallons per car.
Being out of gas, stuck on the road.
Yesterday, there were less than 40 stations open to serve about 5 million people.
So please help by doing your part, or else we may not have enough gas for any of us.
President Nixon signed legislation today aimed at imposing a speed limit of 55 miles an hour throughout the United States as a means of conserving fuel.
The days of 30-cent gasoline were over, and so was the domination of the big American car. Shuichiro Irimajiri was a young engineer at Honda. He remembers when GM and Ford executives came to test drive the small Honda Civic a month before the embargo.
I remember that when they came to our R&D and we showed the Civic to them, at first glance, they said, oh, it's too small to U.S. market.
Today, he is president of Honda of America, which turns out 150,000 cars a year. By late summer of 1974, Americans were all but oblivious to everything but one event, Watergate. And overseas, our friends and adversaries alike simply shook their head.
They were totally befuddled by it all. And as a matter of fact, shortly after I arrived in Europe as a Supreme Allied Commander, almost every head of state and government sought me out. And in private conversation said, what in God's name have you American people done to one of the most effective leaders of this generation?
We know that Nixon was a very shrewd person, clever sometimes, especially in his internal policy. But at the same time, we must appreciate him as a man who was practical, who had some feeling of destination, of destiny, better to say, and who was strong enough to bridge this ideological gap.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
And when you walked out to see them off on the helicopter, it was very difficult. You didn't know what to say. You wanted to say goodbye and add whatever you could, but words weren't very easy to come by. And then when we came back into the White House, I then had to think about my speech to be given after I took the oath of office. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Another long national nightmare was coming to a close as well. In 1973, the last prisoners of war were coming home from Vietnam, and virtually all the U.S. ground troops were already home. Fed up with the long, costly war and the abuses of Watergate, Congress severely limited the war powers of the president and began a drastic reduction of economic and military aid to the South. After a 2-week battle on the outskirts of Saigon, the forces of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were making their final push.
5 days before the fall of Saigon, I was in Hanoi negotiating really the withdrawal, and said to my North Vietnamese counterpart, "You know you never beat us on a battlefield." And he thought about it a minute, and he said, "Well, that may be so, but it's also irrelevant." It was kind of the shortest course in strategy ever given, and maybe one of the most profound.
Since that day was the final decisive one, when our country was liberated, our hatred rose to a high point, and I could say that we were ready to attack and seize the city regardless of the price we would have to pay in order to liberate the entire country.
When I got to the embassy, I realized I wasn't being called over for a meeting. Something else was going on. They were shredding documents, obviously pulling stuff out of files and safes. And so I finally cornered the deputy chief of mission, and I said, "Wolf, what in the hell's going on?" He said, "We're leaving."
The reasons for our involvement in Vietnam, stopping the spread of communism, were all but forgotten. Now the sole objective was to get out.
And so I stood in line with a lot of others up the long stairway leading to the roof with my attaché case and what I had on my back, and finally crowded into this helicopter. And as we took off, you can imagine the scene around you, an embassy that was under siege, if you will, by, at that point, tens of thousands of Vietnamese. And there they were, and I remember turning with bitterness to one of my helicopter companions and saying, "There they are, the hearts and minds that we won." And we kept flying off.
It was all over. What America had spent 12 years and more than 58,000 lives trying to prevent had come to pass anyway. South Vietnam had fallen to the communists. What was the presidential palace is now the Reunification Conference Hall, the occasional object of guided tours. Around the world, our allies were wondering if we could be trusted to honor U.S. commitments to them. America became a country bitterly divided about its veterans, its military, its government, its very place in the world.
So I start from that very sad, tragic time in our nation's history to try and rebuild my own confidence that we were strong enough and able enough, and at the same time to convince our allies that we could maintain the leadership role that was essential for the future of the Western world.
You are as strong as your weakest ally is. And I think you learned that the concept of universal commitment, the very bombastic eloquence of the Kennedy inauguration address, "We will fight any foe, we will bear any sacrifice, we will defend any friend." In other words, we're the boy on the block, we're going to lick anybody whom we don't like, we're going to defend anybody. This unlimited view of American power suffered defeat. So I would say that the paradox of history is such that by learning the lesson of that disaster, American policy corrected itself, but it was in itself a disaster.
We were by now 199 years old. 1976 would be our bicentennial. And what had we learned? Perhaps in Vietnam we had learned that military power can be a dangerous solution to political and diplomatic problems. And maybe we were beginning to learn that presidents, under our system of government, must be more attuned to the voice and will of the American people. During the next 9 years, 2 new presidents would approach America's problems in drastically different ways. Peter Jennings will be back with that.
4585, America and the world since World War II. This special presentation of 4585 is brought to you by IBM.
Imagine if something could signal you when you make a spelling mistake. That would mean you'd be able to correct it before anyone else ever saw it. Well, IBM's Selectric System 2000 typewriters with spell check can do that. It's an electronic dictionary that signals you when you misspell a word. So now if you make a spelling mistake, the whole world doesn't have to know.
Read your type.
Morning, Miss Stevens.
Oh, good morning.
The IBM service representative here? I didn't know there was a problem. Mr. Lewis? Why is he here?
After you buy IBM equipment for your business, we don't stop trying to make it even better.
What's he doing here?
I don't know. Why don't you ask him?
And if we make an engineering change, as part of our maintenance agreement, an IBM service representative will stop by and make the change.
Ask him, yes.
Ask him.
Too much. You? Yes.
And there's a good chance you won't even know he's done it.
No, you ask him.
No. You ask him. Good as new? Better than new.
Because at IBM, our service representatives don't just keep your machines running.
Take care.
They make your machines run better.
He said it was better than new.
Better than new? Think he can fix a 53 Studebaker?
IBM.
When things are out of control, a simple solution is the personal computer software in IBM's Assistant series. Start by entering facts and figures into Filing Assistant. Then move the facts around to work up a plan. Or draw up a graph. There's Writing Assistant to help you handle words. And Reporting Assistant to pull everything together. The Assistant series from IBM. Getting all your ducks in a row has never been easier.
Sunday, it's television's biggest night. A 3-hour celebration of achievement, the symbol of excellence. The 37th Annual Emmy Awards live on ABC. America faces new challenges when 4585 continues.
The toughest part about being a detective isn't the job. It's what the job does to the woman I love.
I can't see you living in the suburbs. Those men deal with success and failure. You deal with life and death. I don't want to lose you.
I don't want to lose you either.
From the series of best-selling suspense novels by Robert B. Parker, Robert Urich is Spencer for Hire, premiering Friday at 9, 8 Central.
Time is running out. Our stock-up countdown is on now with better than ever savings on all your favorite groceries. Look.
Assorted high-C fruit drinks are just 59 cents a can. Chef's Pantry Turkey Sticks are only $1.39 a pound. And Banquet frozen dinners just 69 cents each.
But hurry, time is running out.
It's IGA's stock-up countdown.
Time is running out. Our stock-up countdown is on now with better than ever savings on all your favorite groceries. Look.
Royal Fruit Gelatins are sale priced, 4 boxes for $1. King-size Tide laundry detergent is only $2.98 a box. And save on Pepsi 8-pack 16-ounce bottles and 6 12-ounce cans on sale this week at IGA.
But hurry, time is running out.
It's IGA's stock-up countdown.
That thing ain't never gonna work. Why don't you get a horse?
Great ideas have always met with a little skepticism. The automobile was one, and now there's another. True draft beer in a bottle. New Miller High Life Genuine Draft. The smoothness of draft beer because it's cold-filtered, not pasteurized like most bottle beers. New Miller High Life Genuine Draft.
It works! It works!
And they said it couldn't be done.
Miller Genuine Draft.
A look at special session plans.
So we come
come to this most recent decade since the end of World War II, the last 9 years. Do you remember at the beginning of the 50s we were talking about how many television sets there were in the country? 4 million? Now this has become the symbol of communications, the satellite dish. Vast amounts of information and entertainment for people all over the world. In fact, there's hardly any part of the world today where television has not penetrated. We've come to take computers pretty much for granted in our homes and in our schools. You may have read only recently that the Soviets have just now begun a crash program in computer training in their schools. Technologically, in this field, the Soviets remain very far behind. Here's an example of fallout from American-Soviet political competition. Mary Lou Retton won the gold medal for gymnastics in Los Angeles, but she never got to compete against the Soviets. We had boycotted the Moscow Olympics in 1980, and so the Soviets boycotted the games in Los Angeles. From Pac-Man to Little Man. Well, you were certainly a big hit in Star Wars, R2-D2. Yes, you did indeed. You made us very conscious of robots. In fact, by 1985, the robot population in this country was growing by 68%. And as you well know, that is 66% faster than the human population. Oh, no, hang on. We've got a whole decade to go through here. Despite all these symbols of American accomplishment at the beginning of the decade, we think that if you'd painted a self-portrait of America, we would look pretty battered. Once again, America had to learn lessons in the limitations of power. Iran, for example, and Lebanon. In neither case were we able to say to people, release our hostages or else. Only today did we learn that Benjamin Weir, an American held hostage in Lebanon for the past 16 months, had been released by his captors when they were ready. At the beginning of this decade, Iran and Lebanon were not on our minds. In 1976, America was looking backwards, not forwards. It was our birthday. As a nation, we were 200 years old, proud of our heritage and our way of life. Celebration lasted for almost a year. In 1976, we would learn that America's great symbol of promise was badly in need of repair. Not quite 100 years after she was first erected, the Statue of Liberty is having new strength built into her. In 1976, there would also be a political appeal to repair America's image. And ironically, perhaps, the man we entrusted the job to and elected to the presidency was virtually unknown outside of the state of Georgia. Before 1976, his national claim to fame had been an appearance on the television show What's My Line?
He is Governor Jimmy Carter of the state of Georgia.
Jimmy Carter did what the previous 6 occupants of the Oval Office never dreamed of doing. He chose to ignore the legacy of the Cold War.
We are now free of that inordinate fear of communism, which once led us to embrace any dictator who joined us in that fear.
It was terribly important for the Carter administration to reach back and bring into the fabric of our foreign policy the basic values and principles which had been so important to our founding fathers.
Not predicated on a basis of hatred or disharmony with the Soviet Union as a dominant factor in our foreign policy.
No commander-in-chief since the beginning of the Cold War had ever espoused a foreign policy which did not view the world primarily through the prism of U.S.-Soviet relations. President Carter believed that human rights were as important as military might. For example, he sent Pat Darien of the State Department to put pressure on El Salvador's President, General Romero.
We had a very explicit talk about human rights violations, people getting their heads cut off with knives and their thumbs tied together, and state terror being practiced. And it was a very long talk, several hours. And at the end of it, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head, and he said, "It's a good thing they send a woman to talk about things like this. Men's voices are much too harsh."
Andrew Young was by now Jimmy Carter's UN ambassador. He remembers advice from the ambassador of a Latin American dictatorship.
President Carter has to keep the pressure on. It makes our governments uncomfortable
but it makes all of the people of the world love America.
The Panama Canal Zone. President Carter chose a powerful symbol to dramatize his new approach. He would give the canal to Panama. The canal had been American property since it was built in Theodore Roosevelt's day. President Carter believed the Panama Canal treaties would demonstrate to all of Latin America that Washington, not Moscow, had their best interests in mind. Aristides Royo helped negotiate the treaty for Panama.
They give us a new sense of dignity that we never lose.
When Egypt's President Sadat suddenly decided to make peace with Israel, President Carter saw another opportunity to demonstrate that America, not the Soviet Union, could cement the agreement Israel and Egypt both sought. Using the leverage America had developed in the Middle East since the Suez Crisis, Carter brought Egypt's Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Begin to Camp David. It was Carter's personal touch which would break a critical deadlock. Mr. Carter hand-delivered some autographed pictures for Begin's grandchildren.
He looked at each grandchild's name and called the child's name out. And then the next one and the next one. 8 times he did this. And by the time he was finished reading just the names of his grandchildren, his lip was trembling and he had tears in his eyes. And I had tears in my eyes. And we began to talk about the future of the world for our grandchildren if we didn't have peace. And we parted. I went back to my cabin. In about 15 minutes, he sent word over that he had accepted the issue that he had previously rejected. And it was from there that we went on very quickly and concluded the agreement.
The Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty was a major achievement for American diplomacy. It reaffirmed for the Israelis and for the Arabs there could be no overall peace in the Middle East without American involvement. The Soviet Union would remain a minor player by comparison. But it was also here in the Middle East that a totally unexpected challenge to the Carter administration suddenly appeared. We now call it Islamic fundamentalism. It caught the Carter administration totally by surprise. And it reminded America once again that a superpower cannot always impose its vision of order elsewhere in the world. It began in Iran. America did not foresee the events there. The Iranian Revolution set in motion forces that Washington is still trying to comprehend. From the 1950s, when the United States put the Shah back on the throne, until 1977, when anti-Shah demonstrations were at the gates of Jimmy Carter's White House, America's belief in the Shah's Iran was unswerving.
We look upon Iran's strength as an extension of our own strength, and Iran looks upon our strength as an extension of theirs.
Those words would haunt Jimmy Carter. For as the Shah fell, America failed, overwhelmed by a religious anti-Western revolution. The doctrine of the Ayatollah Khomeini preached in the mosques of Iran was proving to be more powerful than all of America's weapons.
Some people like myself simply did not know that much about the fundamentalist aspects of Islam. I think all of us sort of underestimated the ultimate strength that it would have.
The fundamentalist movement drove the Shah from his throne. The United States could do nothing to save him.
Good evening. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner.
Moorhead Kennedy was one of the hostages.
We were very unruly the first day. And I sat there blindfolded. I'd refused to take my shirt, my tie or jacket off, because after all, you don't take a diplomat hostage, so it must be very short duration. And thinking, my gosh, I've got a dinner party tonight. Very chic Iranian lady, a hostess, and how do I get word to her?
American frustration was heightened by useless negotiations to free the hostages. 172 days later, President Carter tried to rescue them by force. Colonel Charles Beckwith made the decision to abort the rescue attempt because some of the helicopters broke down.
A tough decision. A lot of people say they've made that decision, and I think everybody that said they made it can have the credit for it. But I was standing on the desert floor, and when I was asked, would you go forward with 5 flyable helicopters, I said, hell no. And if I was asked again, I'd say the same thing.
America's prestige lay in ruins on Iran's desert floor. American self-confidence was shattered too. The world's confidence in the United States suffered a similar fate.
It created an impression of a country which cannot actively and assertively protect its interests. And that, of course, is not good for a superpower.
When the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan in December 1979, the United States lost a second buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the oil-rich sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf.
We came to help. By the way, we had an agreement with Afghanistan which foresees such a help.
We were told that we were being sent there to defend the southern borders of our country. And what it came to is that we were going to be fighting against American, Chinese, and Pakistani mercenaries.
From their point of view, the Soviets were acting within their sphere of influence. But the invasion led to Jimmy Carter's conversion.
This action on the Soviets has made a more dramatic change, in my own opinion, of what the Soviets' ultimate goals are than anything they've done in the previous time I've been in office.
The President of the United States.
Afghanistan finally convinced President Carter that Moscow's policies had to be his major concern after all.
Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
Он размазывал эти политические проблемы как масло по куску хлеба одинаковым слоем.
Carter went into hysterics and didn't think about Soviet-American relations. For us, détente was more important than Vietnam. For Carter, Afghanistan was more important than détente.
Iran and Afghanistan are still too fresh to be judged in historical context. But they did leave Americans feeling they could not affect events in other parts of the world, at a time when many Americans were also feeling threatened at home.
You just don't know what tomorrow's going to be like. It scares you.
The symptoms of this crisis of the American spirit are all around us. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years.
More people are out of work and prices are higher. That, in essence, was the government's report on the economy today.
There was a time when made in America meant something. It meant you made the best. Unfortunately, a lot of Americans don't believe that anymore.
There was no doubt the country wanted desperately to believe we had not lost the edge. In many ways, we really hadn't.
This lady may have stumbled, but she ain't never failed. And if the Russians don't believe that, they can all go straight to hell.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
If you just start looking up, you'll find more good things here in this country than anywhere else.
It was as if saying it would make it so.
Welcome home, Columbia. Beautiful, beautiful.
For 200 years, we've lived in the future, believing that tomorrow would be better than today, and today would be better than yesterday. I still believe that.
I, Ronald Reagan.
The country was convinced. And only after Jimmy Carter left the Oval Office did Iran release the hostages. The country was on a national high. The euphoria did not last for long. In 1982, President Reagan sent U.S. forces on a peacekeeping mission to Lebanon. When he committed those same forces to take sides in Lebanon's civil war, the U.S. became part of the problem, not part of the solution.
You see, when the Lebanese fight to liberate their country, America accuses them of being terrorists. But the Palestinians or Lebanese are obliged to do this because there is no logical means to discuss the problem of freedom with America.
When suicide bombers blew up the Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 U.S. servicemen, the Reagan administration experienced the limits of U.S. power.
We didn't understand the background of Islam. When I initially landed in Beirut, I was met by an English-speaking Lebanese army officer. And I told him, I was very anxious, and I told him, please give me a briefing, give me a rundown as quickly as you can on what the situation is here so I can get right to work. And he told me, my friend, you have been in the Middle East for 5 minutes. You probably now understand as much as you're going to understand about the Middle East. From here, it's all downhill.
Ronald Reagan is this country's 8th president since the end of World War II. Now, in his 2nd term, he is widely regarded as having returned American foreign policy to the basic themes of the Cold War.
I know of no leader of the Soviet Union since the revolution, including the present leadership, that has not more than once repeated in the various communist congresses they hold their determination that their goal must be the promotion of world revolution.
We thought that it was necessary to rebuild American strength, Western strength, and also that it was important to face squarely and more realistically the nature of the dangers which we confronted.
When Ronald Reagan ordered American troops to invade the island of Grenada, he told the country he was resisting Soviet and Cuban expansion in the Caribbean. President Reagan calls the Contras, trying to overthrow the government in Nicaragua, freedom fighters. He encourages them because they are challenging a government in Central America supported by the Soviet Union. The president's determination to have a missile defense system in space is a reminder that the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union is as intense as it was 20 years ago.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
40 years ago, the United States had a nuclear monopoly. Now, the superpowers have parity.
And this is maybe the source of frustration in Washington. We had an experience to be inferior to you in military terms. You had no experience to be equal to us.
There is no such thing as equality when it comes to economic accomplishment. America may no longer be the preeminent power on the world industrial scene, but the raw potential of American economic power still sets many of the world's economic trends.
When the President of the United States is not feeling well, the economy of the world is shaken.
More than 60 years after the Russian Revolution, the latest Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, is forced to experiment with a limited form of capitalism, lest the Soviet economy collapse under its own weight. The change has already taken place in China. The present leadership there has decided that individual enterprise and a capitalist reward system are necessary in communist state planning.
Simply no contest, because there are no examples of success on the part of the Soviet Union any place in the world. Soviet economies simply don't work.
The past 40 years have also reaffirmed the essential difference between the two forms of government. Democracy is flexible, a natural environment for change.
diplomacy is not just a symbol. It's a breakthrough.
And what does the future hold? This is what America's most recent political leadership told us.
And I've always felt that our country's greatness was measured by how well we apply the basic moral and ethical standards on which our country was originally founded. How are we using our strength and power, influence, our greatness to enhance human rights, freedom, democracy?
I do not believe there will be a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Every American president that has had the responsibility of nuclear arms knows what the devastation would be in our country and in their country.
I believe the great danger for the future is not between the superpowers and not in Europe, but in the third world.
The real danger, and this is something I feel very strongly about, is the potential of Gaddafi or some other similar leader of a relatively small country will get a nuclear weapon.
We're not the dictators of the world. And there are many people who disagree with us who have some rational reasons for their disagreement because of their different perspective, their different needs, their different way of life, their different religious beliefs, and so forth. And it's imperative that the major nation on earth be willing to accommodate the views of others as long as there is no direct threat to our own security and our own way of life.
President Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev will see each other. They will take each other's measure, and each will understand at the end how far he can push the other without risking retaliation. What we have to understand is that Russians and Americans can be friends, but because our interests are so diametrically opposed, the governments of the United States and the Soviet Union can never be friends, but we cannot afford to be enemies.
So after 40 years, we find ourselves living in a nuclear peace, and it's an uneasy status quo. Just last night, we heard President Reagan say that he is not going to compromise on his plans for a missile defense system in space when he meets Mr. Gorbachev at the summit in November. In a moment, Ted Koppel and I will return in conversation with President Reagan.
This special presentation of 4585 is brought to you by IBM.
To hit the right note on your personal computer, you've got to have the right personal printer. That's why IBM offers an ensemble of personal printers. For text, for color, for graphs, for pictures, for speed, for charts, for letter quality, for whatever you compose. IBM personal printers.
IBM would like to take a minute to show you what it's been doing for years, supporting the arts. This goes to show that a company known for state-of-the-art technology can also be interested in the state of the arts.
If you're thinking of buying a personal computer, and all the signs say it's time to take the first step, a few questions may still be holding you back. Will your PC have the power you want to run the software you want? What about expandability and optional equipment? And how much money is it going to take? If these questions have crossed your mind, Now's a good time to look at IBM, the complete answer. An IBM PC can run the latest, most powerful programs and give you almost unlimited expandability with options like the new IBM printers and the IBM PC network. And today, prices are better than ever. So don't wait. Once you take the first step, the rest come easy. IBM personal computers. See them at a store near you or call your IBM representative.
You may not know this fellow, but he's my son. Well, say hello.
Hello.
He's also my dad.
We'd like to have you watch us on Lime Street.
Robert Wagner in Lime Street, premiering Saturday at 9:30, 8:30 Central.
You'll love it.
4585 continues after station identification.
Next Wednesday, your questions will be answered. Find out who will survive on the astonishing season premiere of Dynasty. Then,
I think I'm falling in love with you.
will guest star Patrick Duffy steal Christina Way on the season premiere of Hotel next Wednesday.
You'll love it.
There could be a Shohoya time in New York. Patrick Ewing is signed with the New York Knicks for a multi-million-dollar deal.
Time is running out. Our stock-up countdown is on now with better than ever savings on all your favorite groceries. Look.
Betty Crocker layer cake mixes are just 66 cents each. Wilson Original or Hawaiian just for us boneless hams are only $4.99 each. And Robert's regular or low-fat cottage cheese is just 88 cents a carton.
But hurry, time is running out.
It's IGA's stock-up countdown.
If you should ever need new flooring, new carpeting, a new paint job, new furniture, a new stereo system, or just about anything else, you can always find it in the GTE Yellow Pages, the most accurate, most complete listing of businesses around. The official GTE Yellow Pages for life's little ups and downs.
The Night Shift.
Mr. President, thank you very much for joining us.
Well,
today.
I'm pleased to be here.
The new Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, recently told the American people that we should know that war will never come from the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union will never start a war. Do you believe him?
Well, I have to say this, that we need more than just those words. I've always felt that, yes, the Soviet Union would like to achieve some of its goals without war, but that does not mean by eliminating the threat of war. Now, if they really mean this, they'll find that we certainly are prepared to go along with that. And, but I think that both of us then must be willing to show our attitude by deed as well as words so that we can have confidence in each other.
Both President Nixon and President Ford, interestingly, have said just before you in this broadcast that they don't think the threat of nuclear war really does come from the Soviet Union, that it comes from some third nation as nuclear weapons continue to proliferate. Do you feel strongly that the Soviet Union is still the central character in this?
Well, I think we're the two superpowers with the two great arsenals of weapons aimed at each other. But I would have to go along with them that a threat now that the world knows how to make such a weapon will always be that sometime, someplace, there may be a madman in the world who comes along and decides to use that weapon. And this is one of the reasons why our Strategic Defense Initiative is so all-important.
Mr. President, we've heard a lot of history during this broadcast. I'd like to turn you a little in the direction of philosophy, if I may. You don't have a great deal of time to cultivate new philosophies. But is the Ronald Reagan who's sitting there today the same one who spoke of the Soviet Union as being an evil empire?
Yes. But I would ask you to think back to some of the things that have happened, such as the shooting down of a passenger airplane with hundreds of passengers simply because it accidentally invaded what the Soviets claim was their airspace. We must recognize that all the statements of Soviet leaders all the way back to Lenin
have made it plain that they are dedicated to the Marxian theory of a world revolution, and that communism requires one day a one-world communist state. I have often quoted Lenin's statement that when he said, we will organize Eastern Europe, or we will take Eastern Europe, which they have, we will organize the hordes of Asia. Well, they tried with China, and at least now they're trying in Cambodia. And then we will move into Latin America, and we won't have to take the United States. It will fall into our outstretched hand like overripe fruit. Well, we've never made any statements like that about them.
Confrontation and antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union. Need it always be thus?
Oh, wait, let me say one other thing. I would prefer the proper word is realism. We have too many times embarked on a program of trying to achieve détente with the Soviet Union, and sort of with looking at them in a mirror image, as if, well, if we just appeal to them and say, look, we're nice people and we don't want any trouble, and why don't you join us? Well, that isn't the way I think is going to happen, and it never did happen.
Where are the areas of opportunity, sir?
We now have redressed our military capability to the point that the Soviet Union does not have an undisputed superiority of such nature that they could deliver an ultimatum, surrender or die. And the fact that the Soviet Union probably recognizes itself how much more they could do for their people, how much more their economy could develop if they were not engaged in this great buildup of weapons.
Is it going to be possible? We've had 40 years of looking at the world through that East-West, Moscow-Washington prism. And we have a very hard time looking at individual problems, South Africa, Nicaragua, Middle East, Persian Gulf, and looking at them in their own terms. We've made some mistakes over the past 40 years because of that. And I wonder how it is ever going to be possible for us to get out of that kind of rigid way of regarding the world.
Well, let me say something else about these 40 years, of a little more optimistic nature. If you look back over the history of wars, Europe, the world, World War I, every time peace was made, the peace laid the foundation for the next war. The rivalries, the hatreds, the divisions were not healed. It was like a truce in which everybody stopped shooting but kept on hating. And then came World War II, the greatest of all. And World War II ended, and frankly, the United States took the lead in a settlement that, as I say, said, wait, now it's over. We are going to help those of you who have been wounded so badly in this war. The Marshall Plan, things of that kind. And today, as I say, our strongest allies are our erstwhile enemies. And 40 years, the longest period they've known of peace between us. Now, I say for the next 40 years, let us build on that. It is true there has been a kind of confrontational thing with one erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union. But that doesn't mean that we give up, or that doesn't mean we succumb to the idea of the inevitability of conflict. We keep on trying as we're trying, in the hope that they too will realize that their system will be better off, they will all be better off, if, like the rest of us, we decide to live in the world together without conflict. And then there could be times in which the Soviet Union and the United States combined could intervene in some of the regional difficulties and some of the minor wars that have started here and there and help bring about a peace. And I believe that all of this is possible. I believe it is probable. And my hope and dream is we're going to start that process really in Geneva in November.
Mr. President, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
This special presentation of 4585 is brought to you by IBM.
run the Hat of the Month Club in a businesslike way, the boss has to keep the books, organize the files, write the letters, be creative, and still keep on top of things. The boss could bring home a tool for modern times, the IBM personal computer. It can help the business person wear many hats and sell even more. The IBM personal computer. Try one on at a store near you.
The Jacquard loom. It may look a little primitive, but in its day, it was a marvel. Here's a harvesting machine. It turned the Great Plains into the breadbasket of our nation. This may not look like an antique, but in a sense it is. It's from one of the first IBM computers. It could solve problems in a few minutes that would have taken a team of mathematicians months to do. But it used vacuum tubes. Remember your old radio? And while these tubes may not seem so big to us, to an engineer or scientist, they pose gigantic problems. They weren't reliable enough, they used too much energy, and they were too big. You see, all these vacuum tubes, which were essentially on-off switching devices, were connected to the other components by miles and miles of wire. Even though electricity travels at the speed of light, the time it takes to go through the system depends on the distance it has to travel. Engineers and scientists wanted to make computers faster. They wanted to make millions of calculations possible in the blink of an eye. So they needed switches that were 1,000 times faster. Today, all those tubes and other electronic components have been compressed onto a tiny chip made from the purest silicon crystal. This chip that can fit through the eye of a needle can do the work of 1,000 vacuum tubes. Now those millions of calculations can be done in the blink of an eye, and they can be done a lot cheaper. In fact, the number of calculations that would have cost more than $1 a couple of decades ago now cost less than a penny. And that means computers are now available to do a lot more jobs, to solve a lot more problems for a lot more people.
We're your type for memos and manuscripts, love letters for labels and laundry lists. If words are the way you write, we're your type. Typewriters, IBM. For contracts, for doctor's orders, for company checks, police headquarters, for offices big and businesses small. We're your type.
The rolling record book, Walter Payton and the Chicago Bears take on Bud Grant's New Look Vikings on an NFL Thursday special, live at 8 Eastern.
Sunday, it's television's biggest night, the 37th Annual Emmy Awards live.
A couple of final thoughts from us about this extraordinary relationship and the forthcoming Soviet-American summit. 150 years ago, and that was 80 years before the communists came to power in the Soviet Union, de Tocqueville wrote that both the United States and Russia seemed marked by the will of the heavens to sway the destinies of half the globe. As we have seen in the last 40 years, there's no point in playing down the importance of a summit meeting. The world has looked to them with fervent anticipation, and that's the way it will be in November. A testament to how important the Soviet-American relationship has been and will be. Ted?
In the context of our lives, 40 years is a big chunk of time. In the context of history, it's a heartbeat. America is still coming to terms with its place in the world. We understand the enormous scope of our power, but we haven't still decided just how and when to use it. We are unlike any other great power that the world has ever known. We are neither empire builders, nor do we feel comfortable imposing our style of government on those who don't want it. Instead, we tend to react when we feel threatened. Ours is a foreign policy that is sometimes tactically brilliant, but without any apparent long-term strategy. And until we formulate such a strategy, we are probably destined to adjust our actions according to those of that other superpower, the Soviet Union, which has always known precisely where it's going. And one thing you may find difficult to believe, but there is more. We told you that 4585 would show you how the future began. In half an hour on a special edition of Nightline,
Peter and I will be back with some remarkable guests to discuss how the future is likely to continue. I'm Ted Koppel.
And I'm Peter Jennings. On behalf of all the people at ABC News who made this broadcast, thank you and good night.
IBM is pleased to have brought you this unique look at America's past 40 years. Thank you for joining us.